projects and not only here in Minnesota but elsewhere. So Mark Merla is head of business development for Finley, and Chris Konecki, no, it's not even close. Yep.
Connection.
Is engineering and in charge of some of the feasibility studies. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to these guys and let them rip. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we have to email them.
So
usually.
since Bill started us off as participating, I'll do the same thing. How many here have been involved in a feasibility study already? About a third of the room, somewhere in there. How many are thinking about getting involved in a feasibility study? About a third of the room. Okay, good. Just to give you a quick idea, Finley Engineering, as Bill mentioned, we've just in the last few years here, we've done probably 20 or 20-some studies. 13 of those were involved with Minnesota counties and cities. Nearly all of them are resulting in built-out networks at this point, and the ones that haven't really are the ones that are newer and we're still working through the process yet. So that's just a little bit about Finley. What do you expect to get out of a feasibility study? And some of you obviously have already thought through that. That is a big topic in itself. There's a lot of things that you could get out of a feasibility study. A lot of people do mini feasibility studies, don't even realize it's a feasibility study. They just try to get an idea of what it's going to cost and is that going to be justified in our project or not. But there's a lot of other things that some people want out of a feasibility study. And just some examples, these are not all in every feasibility study, and in some studies there's more than this list. But just to give you some examples, they may want a market or a needs assessment in the community. They may want somebody to also audit some of what they've already got. A lot of people, it's surprising that a lot of people don't even know what they've got in place now. They may not know that they've got some fiber in place. They don't have any maps that show it. Somebody that was involved in their IT department or somebody several years ago had plans to do something with it, but it got lost in the shuffle. So we find there's a lot of that goes on. Community engagement, they want some guidance on how do we get the community involved. Network designs and different technologies. Costs, of course, sometimes they want mapping of some of the network options that we're designing and costing, so we provide GIS information that shows that. Financial business cases, different provider options. So if we get involved in a feasibility study, typically once the study is completed, we'll take that along with our client and we'll talk to all the different providers in the area and try to get a feel for what they've got in place now, what are their plans in the future, are they interested in taking part of this project, because now they have some costs that they can use to make those decisions. Until the feasibility study was done, usually the provider will say, yeah, we're interested to talk, but that's as far as it's going to go. They won't talk too seriously until they have an idea what the costs are going to be. Partnership options, and then of course, lots of different funding options, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. A lot of studies are initiated because of an RFP that hit the street, a request for proposal. And a lot of times if we're going to talk about studies, I like to include this just as a kind of a cautionary thing. Number one, do a little research. As you all know, broadband is a huge subject. And because of that, I've worded it this way before, but everybody and their pet monkey wants to get involved in broadband. So now all of a sudden everybody's an expert. They can provide designs and costs and studies and things like that. I won't go any further other than just say do some research and make sure there's a lot of experience involved. How much are you asking to be done in your RFP? There's a lot of RFPs that ask for a lot of things. They don't realize that in some cases, they really don't need all that at this point. They're going to be spending money on something they may not even need. So make sure you have an understanding as to what you want to do in a feasibility study. Are you required to take low price? This kind of goes back to that comment I made about everybody and their pet monkey wants to get into broadband. We've had cities come to us and say, hey, we're going to put an RFP on the street to do a feasibility study. Would you respond? And a lot of times I'll say, you have to take low price. And the reaction a lot of times is, well, why? say, because if you have to take low price, we're probably not gonna respond. And the reason being is, again, everybody's an expert, so there's a lot of low bidders out there, and you'll get what you pay for in most cases. And then lastly, if you're gonna put out an RFP, are you providing enough detail in that RFP to be able to compare apples to apples? A lot of RFPs are very general, and in some cases, we kinda like it because then we can respond how we want. But at the same token, from your perspective, if everybody responds with what they want, are you gonna be able to actually compare them to each other? So you need to have enough detail in your RFP for that to happen. Key players, and some of this is common sense, but who would you want involved in a study if you're gonna have one? You may or may not need some of this. So again, this isn't all-inclusive or anything, but possibly a firm like ourselves, financial planner, legal advice, and of course, when we do a study, we engage a lot of your team in the study, so of course your team's gonna be involved. Potential providers, like we said, we're gonna wanna talk to a lot of the providers in the area. The community, and we'll talk about that a little later. And then also, you may or may not, at this early of a stage, may even wanna have some potential investors involved. Options. This is one of the things I think that helps separate a good study from one that maybe isn't so good. We go into a study with the goal of finding a solution that's gonna be built. We don't just come up with one or two options and say, okay, here's the numbers, it may or may not work for you. We go into it trying to figure out what will work and will get built out. So there's a lot of options that can be looked at, and so what we do is we work with you to figure out what are the best options to evaluate, the technologies, what design options, technology options, financing and funding options, partnership options, business structure options, and by that, how many here are familiar with RS Fiber? Okay, quite a few of you. As you know, they actually formed a separate cooperative just for the broadband business. There were townships involved, cities involved, and they actually formed a separate cooperative. So there may be different business structures that need to be put in place, and then lots of different timing options as well, which in some cases can involve costs. So there's lots of, as you can imagine, with all the technologies and different approaches that can be utilized, a lot of it boils down to what are the right options to look at, so we're not spending time on things that are a waste of your time and money. Funding, these are just a few of the examples of things we've seen. A lot of companies can do it maybe out of their own cash or general funds. Most can't when we get into the rural areas. Bonding, whether it's general obligation or revenue or other types of bonding options, bank or loan options, investors, and we'll talk a little bit more about federal or state grants and loans, and then of course third-party grants. And we're very fortunate here in the state of Minnesota when it comes to feasibility studies that actually, I think, now that I think about it, I believe every study we've done for a county in the state of Minnesota was half funded by the Blandin Foundation, if I recall. I'm pretty sure. So, at least we have that option in the state of Minnesota. And speaking of Minnesota, this is probably a great time to be thinking about feasibility studies with all the grant money that's available, especially people that are trying to target the very rural areas. Those are the decisions that have to be made. Can we not do this? State of Minnesota has, in a lot of people's opinions, one of the best programs in the country. And in case you didn't know, they've been going on since 2014. And Minnesota has now provided consulting to at least 25 other states because of the success we've had here in the state with the grant program. And in some cases, they've actually used almost the exact same wording for their bills that Minnesota has used. And in other cases, they've used some of the almost identical wording in their grant applications as Minnesota. And then, of course, as we know, for the first time, we've had a bill bill passed that approved funding for 2 years. So we've got the grant applications this year and again for next year. And in case you're not familiar with some of what's been going on in Minnesota, the different years it's been offered, 2018, it was not. The number of applications that were submitted, as you can see, it's doubled now since it was initially offered. The number of awards that were made, the total amounts that were requested in the applications, and the total amount that the state had approved and was made available. So as you can see, this year there's over 3 times the amount of money requested as what was available. So hopefully that paints a good picture that as we go forward, it proves to some of our legislatures that there's a lot of need out there. Timing, typically for us, 2 to 4 months on a feasibility study. That varies a lot, of course, depending on some of the things I mentioned here. One that is a very big item is most cities and counties have GIS information available anymore. There may be a few that don't, but that in itself makes a huge difference in the amount of time and cost to do a feasibility study. And lastly, the thing I wanted to talk about was community involvement. That can vary a lot depending on what you want out of a feasibility study. Whether it's the person doing the study or the community itself, there obviously needs to be some education and awareness brought to the community. We have found that those communities that usually have 2 or more people in the community that are really passionate about this subject and will help drive it forward, whether it's a task force or some type of organization that's been formed by the county or the city, those that have 2 or more very passionate champions tend to make things happen. The communities that don't, it's a lot harder process. And in some cases, we've had, well, like in one county, Nobles County, I think one of the most passionate champions was a farmer's wife. And she was a major part of getting it going and making it happen all the way through. So I try to find those champions.
She's here at the conference, but Barbara Drawer-Klein is here from LeSueur County, and if you want to see a champion, that's one. She really held some providers' feet to the fire and kind of came through at the last minute and got some applications in for this cycle for LeSueur County, and I think they look really good. So if you wanted to talk to somebody that's a champion, that would be a good resource at the conference.
Other types of community involvement during a feasibility study, surveys, some RFPs that we've gotten want us to do surveys and some have not. So it just varies depending on the community. Speak test verifications. Again, sometimes as part of that, we may do speed test verifications because there may be a provider that claims, oh no, we provide well over 25.3 in that area. And we have a website that gets developed and offered to people in the community, and there's communications that happen that verify whether that's true or not. And so we've actually had to use that. I think in 1 year, I think we even had to use that as proof for a Minnesota grant application.
Yeah, several times. We've used that to say, you know, this area is even eligible or should be classified as unserved when the state has it as underserved.
So we prove through this verification process that no, they are unserved or underserved, that type of thing. And the deed office is very accepting of the proof that we've been able to provide in the past. And then lastly, there may be cases where your community may want to actually have people sign commitment forms that, you know, if a provider or the county or the city decides to build out a network, make commitments that they'll be one of the subscribers of that service. With that.
That last one, is that what you were talking about before about adoption?
so, I mean, so this is, yes, people signing up, that would be a take rate from this business side, whereas adoption is a more general thing of everyone who's using internet in the community.
So this is actually referring to, okay, so if I was gonna come into your community and possibly build out a network, maybe the economics are such that it's borderline, and I need proof that I'm gonna get enough people signing up to make it worthwhile for me to build this network. And so in some cases, they may want to get signups from everybody in the community as to who's willing to sign up with me if I build this network.
So all the providers' take rates added up together equal the adoption rate. So what, company A might have 30%, company B might have 40%, so the total take, that's a take rate for each provider, so that would be the adoption rate, would be the total, that 70%.
And in my case, as a provider coming in, I know if there's other providers, they're probably gonna maintain some of their customers. I wanna know, what can I get? How many are willing to go with my firm if I build it?
Are there other needs that provider needs, like space or data centers, or, you know, cause when we went to that last meeting with the cooperatives for the educational, side of, the program, they talked about having these data centers where they could create, is that also a need that they need to be able to build out in the area, or?
There's
Free
a-
space for a co-location center?
Yeah,
There's
that's
a
what
lot
I'm
of
talking
needs to build a network, and the more, or the better handle that whoever's performing or requesting the study has on those assets, the better suited they're gonna be. So that could be, land that's used for electronics, huts or locations, or data centers, co-location facilities. Is there existing infrastructure, shadow conduit, upcoming construction projects with the ability to place that conduit, power pole infrastructure, if the city has a municipal electric or something of that nature, you know, what's that look like if you wanted to do an aerial build? Cause there's a number of challenges that we'll get into with that, so it can run the gamut of a lot of different things. And one component there is, if you're looking at Minnesota border-to-border grants, this year they specifically asked for, community, contributions to the product, or the project, and a lot of cases that is that, oh, we have a little used park that we would offer up for communications hut space, or, the city has conduit up and down the back alleys of the main business district, and the city would allow for use, so it's just a way for the city to chip in on these projects, or the county or whoever. With that, we'll get into, where I usually step in on these things, and I lead a lot of the feasibility study efforts. So the first thing is to get your team together, because as Mark said, you need those champions, you need various people throughout the, I'll say county a lot, because that's what we've done a lot of in Minnesota, but is there a GIS group or technician that can help wrangle some of this data for us? Are there those champions that can reach out to community members and businesses and get that going? In the case of counties, you'd probably want a couple commissioners on there to help, kind of guide and direct the study and give the county's overall perspective, because they're ultimately the ones footing the bill for this. You may want to invite the electric co-op, whether you view them as a funding partner or a possible provider in some cases, that can be a valuable asset to have there. And the next thing can kind of run quite a bit of variance on how it is, but it's educating the team, making sure those people on the team understand what broadband is, how it gets used, speeds and technologies. They don't need to be able to tell you what different lambdas there are on a fiber network, but just general capabilities of all the different technologies out there, be it fiber, wireless, coax, DSL, and then really making them understand the bedrock problem of all this is that it's expensive to build these networks, and make them see kind of the challenges that the providers are facing, because that will foster partnership and get the county, whoever, and the provider to work together to to get a project going, because that's ultimately the main goal of this, is to get buildable projects.
Yeah, we've actually had studies where, for a community, when we've come in, and they maybe had 7 or 9 different types of providers in that area. And their question to us is, how can we have that many providers and nobody will build this out for us? And so we have to go through that educational process of the actual costs involved and that type of thing before they understand.
And then in some cases, we're working on one right now where a single provider covers 90% of the county, so it can vary quite a bit. And then we get into some initial project research, identifying areas of need. Typically, we talk unserved, underserved, just because the Minnesota border-to-border grant really drives a lot of funding around here. But once you get outside of the state, that can vary quite a bit. And this stage can often dramatically alter the direction of the feasibility study. So when we were looking at Otter Tail County, that was one of the bigger studies we'd ever taken on in Minnesota. And we were kind of worried about how we were gonna stay within budget on our end and adequately represent such a huge county. It's probably 4 times the size of most of the Minnesota counties, and it's twice as dense on a per mile basis. When we got out and we're talking to providers and talking about their plans, the 2 big providers in that county are Otter Tail Telecom and Arvig, and they had us in the county in a room, and they kind of laid out their 5-year roadmap, and we said, okay, well, we don't need to look at 75% of the county, and that allowed us to really drill down, get a lot more valuable information on a per subscriber, per mile basis, and it drove accuracy in the study results. And then next, identify resources. This is something that we kind of talked about earlier with, who has resources in the county that are usable? Is there a larger regional provider that could provide fiber backhaul for wireless networks? Is there municipal, county fiber infrastructure? The existing providers, where are their head-end locations? It doesn't do any good to build a huge fiber network and then have little to no connectivity with the outside world. We have to find out where all those connection points are. And then another one I'll come back to is, aerial versus buried, the aerial lines. We worked with the city in Colorado. They understood that aerial construction can be cheap, but there's a lot that has to go into that ahead of time. And their municipal electric instituted a 5-year plan, and they'll be done next year. But they will be ready for an attacher on all poles, and that dropped costs by about 40%. So if it's done right, those are the kind of things that the county and the city can help with.
And in that case, that's one of those where timing is very important in how they're gonna proceed forward.
Some of the other.
What do you mean by that?
In other words, they were working on their pole infrastructure, and they had a plan that was gonna get that all in line over the next few years. So if they needed to build a broadband network too soon, it was gonna cost them more to deal with pole make-ready costs. In other words, getting the poles ready, because there were things out of compliance and old poles and things like that. And pole make-ready costs can be extremely expensive. In fact, there was one community in Colorado, I think it was up to $15,000 a pole, because so many of them had to be replaced.
And in that particular case, there was so much rock that buried was expensive, and wasn't a municipal power company, it was a local cooperative, and it was cheaper for us to build a second pole line. Than that was the cheapest method of construction we could find. So that's kind of being discussed at the local level right now, and there's some stuff coming out of that, but just driving these conversations oftentimes can dramatically change numbers and what options we look at.
People hear things like it's so much cheaper to go aerial. And in a lot of cases it is, but in some cases, there's so much work that has to be done on the aerial infrastructure, it may be cheaper to bury. So,
And is that because of the regulations for the electricity? Is that what you're saying?
just in general on aerial and buried, you can see everything in the air, and you can tack a cable up and run down the line. Buried, you could hit rocks, you have to work around other utilities, it's much more labor intensive, so that can kind of get the cost up on that side.
So you really don't understand the whole picture until we actually look at all of the different options.
Have you ever gotten use with, electric poles that are, let's say, by Minnesota Power, and rent out space on these poles to carry, fiber controlling poles if it has to?
Absolutely, if we're gonna look at an aerial option, the first thing we'll do is contact those power companies in the area, and we will look at, we'll try to get as accurate a cost as we can on, what the lease rates are to attach to the pole, so that's, you know, pole lease, a cost and an attachment cost. And then we build that into the model, because that's a rent effectively, and that affects your business model. And then we also try to get as much information as we can as what's the overall condition of your pole line? Are these poles 10, 20, 30 years old on average? What's your replacement strategy? And that all goes into our costing model.
This was brought up at another discussion class, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. Have you had any experience with, the potential 5G, installations that are being considered to come into communities?
So we've seen some equipment tested. We have not done any installations. The one thing I'll tell you with 5G is that you're gonna have to have fiber very deep into your network. And the reach on those radios is very short, less than 1,000 feet. So if you think about building a city or a town, you're pretty well gonna have to have a site every block and a half. And if you've got fiber that deep in the network, it being such a young technology, a lot of people aren't really viewing that as a viable option as of yet. And that's definitely gonna be towns and cities only. If you think 3-4 houses per mile and I need a station every 1,000 feet, you might as well just plow fiber right to the house at this point.
Well, part of the problem with that is that at this point, the legislation has authorized 5G, providers can basically come in on city right-of-ways and you can't stop them.
There's a huge,
And,
there's a huge.
Well, our city did an ordinance that doesn't allow that.
Mhm.
It hadn't been tested legally, but then the company that was thinking about bringing it in went to the, Minnesota Power, and Minnesota Power gave them permission to use their right of way. So our ordinance really doesn't mean a whole lot. They're right next to each other.
Yep.
I'm just
So
asking about, because that's gonna happen.
it's a coming
reality.
thing, and
I'm
not
afraid.
anybody's really sure how that's gonna shake out yet.
Yeah.
Anyways, back to the slide here. Setting goals is important, just so we keep focus on what we're trying to accomplish here. Often the primary goal is fiber to the home. That's what everybody wants, but as Mark said, we're trying to get buildable projects here, so it may not be fiber to everywhere all at once. It may be a hybrid fiber wireless network. It may be a hybrid fiber coax network. It can take a lot of different forms. So kind of having that backup plan and those options, like Mark talked about, can really let the county feel like we're moving the ball forward.
We have one provider that built out pretty well all of the un- and underserved portions of the county with a combination of fiber and fixed wireless. With the intent, knowing that their payback on the fixed wireless was much faster, with the intent of taking some of those revenues from the fixed wireless and then eventually building more of that fiber network out further and further into the customers. So they're trying to utilize the quick turnaround on, I think in fact, some of their payback on the fixed wireless is what, in a year and a half, 2-year range?
Yeah, 18 months to 2 years can be that short.
20, 30 years or better on fiber in some cases, so.
So once we have some goals set, then we can start engaging with those providers, learning from them what we can. We tried to look on a 5 to 6 year horizon for what the existing incumbent providers are gonna do in the area. Because realistically, these things take a lot of time. By the time somebody puts out an RFP, selects a firm to do the study, you do the study, you present the results, you get the findings. I mean, that whole process can easily take close to a year. And then if we're hoping for grant funds in some form to be a part of this, that can take another year. And, you know, you're 2 years out, and then it takes a year, 2, 3 years to build a project. These things can drag out for a while, and it's just kind of the nature of the beast, so.
A lot of that depends on the type of client we have. I mean, if we're working with, say, a rural electric co-op or a telco co-op, and it doesn't even have to be co-ops, I mean, any of those types of organizations, they could make their process off and running within a year, year and a half. But oftentimes, if you're working with government, cities, counties, that year, year and a half can easily turn into 3, 4, 5 years. That's based on
Yeah,
a
and
lot of experience.
in the case of Colorado, they're, one of the towns we're working with, they were looking at possibly moving forward with a penny sales tax initiative that would have had to go to a vote. So now you're throwing that into the timeline as well, and everything just flows back from there. So, and like I said before, the provider engagement, that phase can really alter what the study looks at, kind of our overall plans and feel for everything. And lastly, on the kind of the front end, we do a lot of the community engagement. Let the public know what you're doing, know this is on tap, and start to build that momentum for the projects that may come. Talk about some of the provider and project obstacles. I'm sure a lot of the providers in the state would love to just build fiber to everywhere, but the economics just are not there. Rural Minnesota, we're seeing anywhere from $15,000 to $20,000 or better per mile on fiber, and that's a big number to bear when you're talking about 3 subscribers per mile and $60 a month, $70 a month. So if you think about the payback on that, it doesn't look really great. Fortunately, there are a lot of funding options. This is a map of all the awards from, I think it's the 2017 grant cycle, which was the last one that was awarded. And the deed office does a pretty good job of spreading the pot around when it comes to that. Ultimately, what we're trying to do with this feasibility study is make the case that we can do something. As Mark said, the providers all say their talk. We're trying to use the fishing analogy, we're trying to make that lure look a little bit better. We're trying to get a provider on the line and get the ball moving forward. And one of the things that we'll get into on the next slide is how we do that. But one of the big things that the providers want to know beyond just the hard numbers is they want to know who will take service. And that kind of gets back to service commitments and surveys. And there's differing opinions on surveys. Some people want to do a survey up front because they want to know, a good idea of who will take service. But some people just want to do the study because they know if they got to get a 90 or 100% take rate, that's never going to happen. The project isn't going to be feasible. So you got to kind of look at your situation and make sense if it makes sense to do a survey up front. And the one thing I'll say is about surveys is it's important to do a statistically valid survey versus kind of an anecdotal survey. It's the squeaky wheel gets the grease. If you put up a survey on the community Facebook page, everybody that's got terrible service is gonna sign up and it's gonna look great. But if you have a randomized survey that's either calling or door to door, you can really dial that in and get a much better picture of who will and won't take service. We'll talk about technologies for a little bit. Fiber, obviously the ultimate solution, that's probably what most people would prefer to have. It's a 30, 50, 70 year better asset. It's nearly infinitely scalable. you know, if you were, in on Mitch's presentation on the wireless side, everything flows back to fiber, whether it's wireless, coax, whatever, DSL. The problem is it can be up to 7 times or more the cost of a wireless network or some other sort of technology. We talked a lot about aerial versus buried. Where we're at, southern Minnesota, cornfield country, just throw the plow in and go. It's pretty easy plowing, and buried makes a lot of sense. We don't look at aerial options very much in that part of the country, but we're working with Roseau Electric, and that's an exciting project in that they want to self-build. They have a lot of aerial plant. They have the crews to do it, and they're excited about the challenge, and they're taking advantage of some new product. It's not technically the newest thing on the market, but some of the pieces and parts that they're using are new to the market, and it's making use of what's called the power space. So per national codes, you can only have communication lines so close to a power line, but since they own those lines and they can basically grant themselves an exception, it's gonna allow them to very cost effectively build out their network.
Can you say that just one more time? So there's a regulation that if somebody outside of an electric, they
So-
wouldn't have that same opportunity?
So the whole electric plant in the country is governed by what's called the NESC, it's the National Electric Safety Code. And that dictates power lines effectively. And one of the sections in there talks about communication lines on power poles and how close those things can be. There are exceptions to those clearances, however, you need to be granted the exception by who owns those poles. And it's a hard road to hoe, if you're not the same entity.
You have to be an electrician essentially,
And there's,
certified to work on power
right,
lines,
there's-
work that close to them.
you have to have high voltage
So
safety
it's
training.
more expensive still
And
in person.
that can be, the labor rates are 25% higher on those qualified personnel. But Roseau already employs those crews, and they're gonna train them to do fiber as well, so, that's kind of a moot point for them. Time to deploy, we kinda talked about this, before, but fiber takes a while to deploy, several years oftentimes. So we'll kinda skip over that, and low ongoing maintenance costs. Once you have fiber networks in the ground, when we're talking about copper networks, be it DSL or cable, or even wireless networks, there's glass, nobody bothers with it. Generally, they're pretty low maintenance. Now, if you do have a cut or somebody runs over a pedestal or a cabinet, that can be, some downtime and maintenance costs there that can spike up. But in general, just general trouble calls and that sort of stuff seem to go down quite a bit with fiber. Next is wireless, and we're specifically talking about fixed wireless. I probably should have thrown that in there. And fixed being the transmission and the receiving unit are fixed in a location. It's not mobile where your device travels around, or satellite where the satellite moves through the air and you're doing all these handoffs. It's fixed locations on both ends. And what that really allows is for that hardware and software that are in these devices to maximize the connection and to make the best connection they have. I've got whole slides on all the technologies and beam steering and channel selection that go into this, but, for this point, we'll kind of just leave it at that. Kind of where we view wireless, it's adequate and beyond for today's needs. I don't think we would have said that 6 or 7 years ago. We would have said probably that fixed wireless couldn't really scale. But with technology advancements, we are seeing that, and it's kind of this leapfrogging of technology and usage, and they keep kind of going back and forth. But for the last 6 or 7 years, I would definitely say that technology is providing more bandwidth than what the average person uses. And it's still ongoing. And then also, if we jump down to the fight for spectrum, the FCC is talking about opening up a lot of swaths of spectrum, and that will only increase the efficiency of fixed wireless. It's very cost effective and quickly deployed. A lot of times if there's an existing tower asset, maybe a month or less, you could get fixed wireless turned up, and it really is a high speed deployment. But some of the coverage challenges, if you've got a heavily treed area, if you've got a lot of topology changes, fixed wireless can be kind of a challenge to deploy. Where we're at southwestern Minnesota, as long as you can avoid the cottonwood trees, you're pretty much good to go. And this is Westbrook, Minnesota, so you can see how flat that is. That's prime fixed wireless territory. And last, what does 5G mean for rural America? Just a few seconds on 5G. 5G can mean 10 different things to 12 different people. It's kind of a moving target. What one person calls 5G is not exactly what another person calls 5G. Two things that 5G will use, it's not a single chipset or frequency or anything. It's a combination of all these things to do multiple things. So if we talk about the characteristics of broadband, you need speed first and foremost, but you also need reliability, and you need latency, which is basically the time between, Bill's on his iPad there, he requests an email from the Google server, how long does that data take to get from A to B? And all these wavelength characteristics do different things. So if I have a really low frequency, I can blast through trees and everything else, and it's super reliable, but there's no bandwidth there. If I'm up at 80 gigahertz, the millimeter wave spectrum, the frequency that's gonna drive gigabit type speeds, that's only gonna go a couple thousand feet at most. So it's kind of meshing those things together, and that's what'll drive 5G usage. On the high speed deployment, that probably doesn't bode well for a lot of, truly rural America. When we do a feasibility study, we'll kind of burn through this here, but one thing that I'll leave you with is we don't just look at a couple options, put out a report, and we're done with it. We build a model, and that's the county or cities to keep. We gather chunks and chunks and tons of information, and that can be picked apart, analyzed, and utilized by anybody else. So it's a living, breathing thing. As costs go up, as new grant programs come up, as areas get served, this is a living, breathing thing that can and should be updated. And lastly, study results. This is how you get the word out about what you did and what your findings are. You definitely want to talk with your providers and engage the public. One of the best stories we had is Polk County. We had a not great looking feasibility study, but they had a community meeting at 2 o'clock in the
You might want to
afternoon.
clarify what that means, not a great look.
The numbers looked terrible. They were not good at all.
The cover picture was
they were losing millions of dollars on a 25-year span. So, from that point, they didn't look great. But that county packed over 100 people in a room for a 2 o'clock on a Tuesday presentation of these results, and there were providers there, and they're like, okay, we can get a take rate. How do we shore up the financial side? So that's, and in that case, they didn't hit a home run. They only covered a third of the county, but it's a start. It's building on success and keeping that momentum going, and they've got more applications in the hopper for the next year. So with that, I think we kind of used our time up, so.
Is there any questions? How much time do we have for questions?
Well, the next session starts in about 9 minutes, so.
Any questions?
So we utilize a GIS mapping system, and we're also starting to employ some software that will automatically map routes. So we'll set, backbone locations, hut locations, and the software will automatically calculate the most efficient routes and gather up some of this data. So that allows us to test different methods and routes and kind of build some efficiency there.
I want to thank Mark and Chris. We find quite a few of their clients around the conference that have worked with them, so hear more. And you guys got a table in the exhibitor room as well. So.
I'll just add on, so 2:30 is our next session, and it's maybe a really nice spot